Congress is not quite back in session, but there certainly has not been a lack of political news this week. On Rising, we covered the climate town halls, Democratic debates, and the latest battleground races. First up, we wanted to recall the interview we did with the president of the Nebraska Farmers Union, John Hanson, who talked to us about the real-world impacts of the trade war. Let's take a look.
China is the classic example of state-owned capitalism. They've been not playing by the rules for some time, and they obviously need to be reined in. The U.S., I think, should have isolated China from the rest of the world community as they started on this effort. Instead, unfortunately, the president has isolated the U.S. from most of the rest of the world economy. It was a huge unforced error.
Saagar, this is one of the days that you were out.
Yes.
You would have liked this guy. He was very interesting, very nuanced view, basically saying, you know, we should have dealt with this China issue before. We're not dealing with it the right way now. He also put a lot of context around the fact that farmers for the past 7 years have been seeing their incomes decline. So they already didn't have a lot of margin for error. And then you add on top of this the trade war. It's been very difficult to do.
Yes, but I do think what he gets wrong is his argument is fundamentally an Obama argument, which is that we should use the international community in order to rein in China. The truth is that China is so beholden to us that just using the might of the U.S. economy, you can kneecap them through tariffs. And that's exactly what's happened. Their economy is slowing down massively. They have huge domestic problems of their own. They need to sustain growth levels of like 7 or 8% in order to keep things not from going rocky in Beijing and throughout the rest of the country. And that's not what's happening. So the more that we can punish them, the more that you can basically make up the rest and stop U.S. companies from having all the supply chains in China. So I would just counter that the U.S. is actually so big and so powerful that we don't have to
certainly
to go
wouldn't
about the way
hurt
he wants
to have our allies behind us as well.
They're sold out to Beijing long ago, and we should just give up.
You've given up on them. He also talked about climate change and the floods that they've had and what an impact that has had. And it was very interesting because I said, you know, is this something, are farmers connecting these weather patterns with climate? And he said, look, there is no doubt that every single farmer knows the weather patterns are changing. Whether they're going to call it climate change or whatever, like that is just reality for us right now, which was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Next, YouTuber and friend of the show, Kyle Kalinske. He weighed in on the media's Andrew Yang blind spot. Let's take a listen.
So you don't get coverage of them, and you certainly don't get coverage of like, hey, Tulsi Gabbard's main thing is she wants to end interventionist regime change wars. Let's talk about, you know, what the benefits are of that. Hey, Andrew Yang's thing is universal basic income. Let's talk about, you know, why this might be a wonderful idea. So, yeah, the fact that they're not covering them, and they're certainly not covering them objectively or substantively, I think it definitely has a difference. You could easily see these candidates at maybe 5% or more if they just got their fair shake.
I think he's right. I mean, it's like we already were talking about. Andrew Yang is already beating Beto O'Rourke and others in the Real Clear Politics polling average. The corresponding number of amount of coverage is laughable, and it's because people in politics are very used to a regimen that candidates do this, then they do that, and they roll something out. They roll out a plan. They come at things from a very familiar level. Half these reporters used to cover Capitol Hill, so they know who they're talking about.
Right.
And then somebody like Yang comes out, and they just have no idea what to do. Literally, they just write it off.
For it. Yeah. And so it's not just the lack of coverage, it's then also the quality of coverage, which is hard to sort of quantify, but some candidates they cover as serious candidates who have real shot, and some they cover as like a sideshow, right? And that can't help but influence people when they're deciding who they're going to support. If the dominant narrative that they're getting from the media is, oh, this person's not serious, they're a sideshow, they're just kind of an oddity here over for us to occasionally gawk at, that's also going to influence people's votes. And yeah, it does matter when you look at the polling, how that media coverage has gone.
Absolutely.
So after 7 hours of primetime town halls, climate scientist Michael Mann told us which candidates' answers stood out to him the most. Let's take a look.
They want to be able to stir up a lot of controversy around your light bulbs, around your straws, and around your cheeseburgers. When 70% of the pollution, of the carbon that we're throwing into the air comes from 3 industries.
Now, you have a very unique and personal insight into the way that the fossil fuel industry organizes to make sure that nothing changes. What did you think of Warren's response here?
Yeah, I really appreciated that response, and it really, it reinforces my own views on this, that we're sort of, moving past outright denial of the science.
Yeah, it was interesting his take on how the sort of approach from the right to climate had changed. There was denial, which was funded extensively by the fossil fuel industry, and that Michael was attacked by those interests aggressively, by the way, sued, et cetera. And it's shifted now because we see the extreme events happening. We see the change, and so it's sort of undeniable. So now they've shifted to this sort of like either throwing up their hands, oh, but we can't do anything about it, or picking fights over straws and cheeseburgers and light bulbs.
Yeah, but I touched on this also, which is that Kamala Harris and a lot of these other Democrats, they lean into this because that's how deeply they've really thought about climate policy, I think, which is they want to ban plastic straws, they'll ban plastic water bottles from SFO airport, but that's about as far as they go, and it's very unserious. I mean, in this way, I basically agree with Elizabeth Warren, which is that when Kamala Harris and these other people are talking about banning plastic straws, they're not talking about the actual problem.
They're missing the point.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that's exactly right. And
Yeah.
it's the sort of white, affluent, liberal base who wants the signaling. They want to feel good about, like, oh, I switched to
I
a paper
recycle.
straw. Oh, I drive a Tesla, right? I recycle. These are all good things. I'm not saying they're not good things. And as Warren herself said, like, anything that you're doing to reduce your carbon input, great. That's fabulous. But it's also not really getting at the root of the problem.
Exactly.
It's unserious.
Yeah, totally.
That was a little bit of what we covered this week. We will be posting some answers to your Twitter questions tomorrow. Make sure you catch that.
Stay tuned.
Have a great day, folks.
See you guys.